Yeah, exactly. Happy Saturday, everybody, and welcome back. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for the conference today. We're really excited for a few exciting and interesting keynote speakers this morning. So without further ado, we'll get started. I'd like to invite to the stage our speaker this morning, Dr. Dominic Abrams. Dr. Abrams is a cardiologist and electrophysiologist in Boston. As we're aware, he trained in the UK and was a consultant at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and has moved to Boston Children's Hospital as the co-director for the Center of Cardiovascular Genetics. Dr. Abrams.
Great. Do we have the slide mover? Yeah. It's gone AWOL overnight. We got it. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you again for the invitation to be here. It's been an absolute pleasure and a wonderful meeting, and I've greatly enjoyed being part of it, and it's been a great honor to be invited to speak today. So I thought I would, after yesterday's fantastic day, change tack slightly and talk about teamwork and how we can integrate teamwork into healthcare, and also mental skills that we can use personally to help us with that. And this is something that I've become fascinated with over the last several years. And I thought it would be fair to give an explanation as to why I was speaking about teamwork and how I got to this point. But I do think that this conference has beautifully spoken to that. And the word teams and teamwork was mentioned a lot yesterday, and rightly so. And sort of thinking very much about how everyone has come together. And I think HiRO really exemplifies that perfectly. So, as is often the way in our lives, this was a culmination of many years of kind of reflection and then different events occurring to me at different times. And I was sort of starting to think about, well, what makes a high-performing team? What are the fundamental constituents of that team if it's going to succeed and do well? And particularly, what does that look like in healthcare? During this period that we were building our own team in Boston, so a cardiovascular genetics team was starting where we hadn't really had one before. And so we were sort of thinking like, well, what does that look like in the current era? And I think what that looks like today is very different from what it looked like then. And so things are constantly evolving. And that's why I think having so many of the stakeholders around the table who are now integral parts of that team. And we need to be thinking about working across some of the sort of traditional boundaries that may have existed in the past. What does a team look like today? And how do we think about structuring that? And so to do that, I went back in my own medical career and looked at different experiences I'd had and potentially why they were very successful or very impactful to me. The first was at a hospital called St. Mary's Hospital, and it's in West London, in Paddington. It's where I trained. And I was what's called a house officer at St. Mary's, which is the kind of most junior person of all the junior people. So you are bottom of the ladder. But I look back on it and this wonderful year of training and a wonderful experience. And so it was sort of something that really stuck in my mind as a very happy time and a very successful time. And then towards the end of my training, I went to another hospital just across London in East London called St. Bartholomew's, which celebrated its 900th anniversary last year. And that's ultimately where I became what's called an attending or a consultant. And again, it was a very, very impactful period. So I sort of was thinking, well, why were those good? What was it about those organizations, the institute? What was it that made that good? Whereas other teams I've been in, and I'm sure you've all had this experience as well, weren't quite as good, but maybe should have been. So kind of thinking about it more from a structured level. And then I was very lucky to go to MIT for 2 years. And obviously that gives you a great opportunity to think about these things in greater depth, to speak to other people and learn about it in a more structured fashion. I also started to reflect back on my own experiences in sport, and many of you may have had the same kind of experiences. And I wanted to just explain this briefly because my specific sport was rugby. And I know that's not something that's desperately common or much viewed in North America. So you're going to hear a little bit about that. And I just wanted to sort of set the scene about that. But it's a sport I played an awful lot. And of course, when you're thinking about sports, teamwork is fundamentally integral, whether it's a sport like golf where you're playing on your own, or a sport like rugby where you're part of a team of 15, or hockey where you're part of a team of 6. So I don't think it matters that it's rugby. It could be an orchestra, it could be an ice cream shop, it could be anything, but just sort of having that personal experience was sort of super helpful to start reflecting back on. And then, as is often the case, there were sort of 2 defining moments that made me suddenly think, well, I need to stop thinking about this and actually start doing something about it. And one was a book by a guy called Owen Eastwood, which I will speak about. And the other one's a course that I went on with a guy called Aaron Walsh. And they're both New Zealanders and both know each other, but I sort of came to them both in different ways. And if we think about how we do things in healthcare, we focus a lot on the process. Have we got the right equipment? Have we got the clinic structured in the right way? All these different things. Does the hospital look nice? And there's a lot of focus on process, but people are fundamentally involved in the process of driving performance. And if we think about performance, ultimately, what do we do in healthcare? We are there to improve the lives of patients. How do the people who are delivering that care, how are they involved in that? And how do we work with them to get the best out of them, which is ultimately what a team is. So in terms of thinking a little bit of background, what is a team? Well, these are 3 individuals who all worked at HBS in Boston and have defined the teams in different ways. And you can look online, there's many, many ways to define a team. But in this situation, it's a small number of people. This is Katzenbach and Smith. So a small number of people with complementary skills who are committed to a common purpose, a set of performance goals and approach for which they hold themselves mutually accountable. Below that there's a guy called Richard Hackman, who's sadly no longer with us, who was sort of the doyen of teams and team analysis. He was an organizational psychologist at Harvard. And he sort of set out the 5 definitions that he thought were very important. Teams must be real. And by that, he means teams have to be constructed for a specific job or a specific reason, not just, well, you're a team because you're sitting on that table or you've got offices close to each other. Those are not real teams, and they surprisingly don't do very well. They must have compelling direction and purpose. They must have an enabling structure within the team. Get the right people on the bus, get the right way, do it the right way, and the team will be successful. It's fundamental if you're part of a team in a bigger organization that you have organizational support. Otherwise, you're constantly sailing into headwinds that are going to be obstructive. And then really importantly, that team needs to be expertly coached. And that's sort of, we're going to come back to as a theme throughout this, having the right people coaching, mentoring, supporting, helping that team succeed and do what it's trying to do. So that was Hackman's kind of basic 5 tenets for the importance of a high-performing team. But I'm always fascinated by sort of the history of medicine. And this was the first reference I could find to teamwork in healthcare. This is a guy called Major General Sir Bertrand Dawson. He could only be British. And he was a physician who started his career in the late part of the 19th century. And then from 1915 to 1918, he was on the Western Front in the First World War as a physician. And in the July of 1918, he gave this talk on the future of medicine. And it was very interesting that he sort of started to allude to these concepts, but very much came from his experiences during the First World War. He talked about coordinated effort and teamwork. He talked about investigation may be started by a single individual, but for fruitful results, a carefully selected team is needed. And he also spoke about the importance of leadership, developing talent, coming through. Otherwise, he said, your department will become sterile and will not flourish. So even 100 years ago, he really understood these principles that I think are really still very true today. And there's been a lot of work since then, as I found out when I went back to start researching this. In 2000, there was a publication from the National Academies about safety. This is about a 300-page book, but as you can see, they spoke to teamwork in different ways and spoke about the importance of it. And then lots of different studies have been done focusing on different aspects. This is one of the most common, where we think about inputs, mediators, training, and outputs. Inputs being the sort of attributes, the structure, and the leadership and the culture of the team. Mediators being how that team functions in different situations in real time. Training, fairly obvious. How can we train that team? How can we evaluate that importantly? And then outputs being the safety that the team provides and the quality of care. And importantly, the members and the well-being of the membership of that team. And you can, as you can see, divide it up into multiple different ways to assess the outputs of any team. But we started to think about this a little bit differently, just trying to make something very, very practical and something very easy for people to use. And so when we were constructing our team in Boston, we were sort of thinking about 3 things that were really important to us, and they were belonging, purpose, and value. And then subsequently, you can see integrated within that is leadership, the environment in which the team functions, and then how we define success. So value. This is a guy called Ed Catmull, and Ed Catmull was the CEO of Pixar when they were hugely successful. He took them from being a small organization in a sort of warehouse in Oakland over a bridge somewhere to being the organization that we all know today. And this was an organization I was very lucky to study at business school, but I was fascinated in many aspects of what they did. And I still think that Monsters, Inc. is one of the greatest parodies of corporate America. But why were they so successful? Why could they constantly turn out film after film after film that was very different and still be hugely successful? Well, Creativity Inc. is the book he wrote about this, and it's a fantastic read. And he spoke about lots of different factors, but one of his quotes was, "Great ideas can and do come from anywhere." So it's hugely important to value people in your team, because you may find that the very junior intern who's sitting in the corner not saying anything, if they don't have the confidence or feel safe to speak up, you may be missing a hugely important piece of information that's key to what you're trying to do. And I think he also went back into his own career. He was a PhD student at the University of Utah. His entire PhD was to make a hand do that on animation. That was 6 years of research, but in those days, that's what it took. But he spoke about this very empowering environment that he was in. They were given autonomy, they were given freedom to work, freedom to experiment and to get things right and to get things wrong. And I think that fundamentally shaped the way Pixar became from his early experiences in Utah. One of the other things that I think they did extremely well was this concept that you may have heard of called the Brains Trust. And the Brains Trust was when a new producer would bring a new film idea to a group of people within the organization. And they would give very honest and candid feedback about that film, which was sometimes, I don't think brutal is the word, but very, very candid. And they did that there was sort of two key aspects to that. Firstly, it was done because everyone wanted that film to be better. So they had to be sort of really honest and really clear about where was this film going, so they understood it, but giving that very candid feedback. But it was also fundamentally built on trust. So they all trusted each other, they all respected each other. Therefore, the feedback was about the film. It was not about the person who was producing that film. And when you sort of read about this, you hear about how they were able to develop these sort of what he calls ugly babies into these kind of amazing films that they became. How does that reflect in healthcare? This is a study by Amy Edmondson. Many of you may have heard of her. She's at Harvard Business School as well. This was a study that was published in 2001, so it's only 25 years old now, which is staggering. They looked at 16 cardiac surgical centers, and they looked at how those centers could adopt a new surgical technique, and how long it took them to do that. And they gave two examples which are fabricated. There's Mountain Medical Center and Chelsea Hospital. Mountain Medical Center was very successful at doing this. They adopted it quickly and efficiently, but that was quite a small rural hospital, not a big cardiac program, but one that was growing and developing. As opposed to Chelsea Hospital, which was a major academic medical center with the professor of surgery and all the bells and whistles, who were much slower to adopt it. So they looked at why. And the factors related to success were three basic ones: the team design and the management. As I said, getting the right people involved, but also telling those people why they're involved. There was a fundamental concept on learning. We're all doing this together. We're working as a group on this, breaking down the hierarchies and developing psychological safety. They sort of framed the challenge to motivate people. People were specifically chosen to be part of that team, and there's a lot of quotes in the paper that you can read, and sort of, explained how powerful it was to be part of that team. And they said, created this safe environment where people felt free to speak up. In Mountain Medical Center, it was kind of, oh, well, you're in the OR on Tuesday, therefore you're doing this procedure. Not, we've selected you because you bring a specific skill and we want you to help in engaging this and helping how we learn about this. So how that was sort of structured was very, very important in the success of this, not surprisingly. And she said, this is the last sentence of the paper: senior leaders need to look beyond technical competence and identify leaders who can motivate teams of disparate specialists so they can learn the skills needed to succeed. Purpose, also very important. This is a guy called Greg Dyke, who was Director General of the BBC, which back in the day was a very major position in the UK. I think it's slightly not quite what it was then. But he was Director General of the BBC back in the early 2000s, and I was very fortunate enough to hear him speak. I actually thought I was hearing someone else speak, so I went in not a particularly good mood, and then he spoke, and it was fantastic. So don't judge anything before you've actually seen it, was the lesson there. But he said, people ask me, what do you do as Director General of the BBC? What's your job description? And this was what he said is, My job is to give people a reason to get up in the morning and come to work. He then went on to speak about how he operated. He said, everyone calls him Greg. He has an open door policy to his office. And you thought, this all sounds great. Is that the reality? And sometimes these things don't always quite match up. About a year later, he had a big fallout with the government in the UK. There was a rather sordid event related to this sort of theory that Saddam Hussein could launch nuclear missiles in 45 minutes. It turned out that was in someone's PhD. They got off the internet, not high intel. It's a whole nother story, but it was a pretty unpleasant affair. And Greg Dyke stood behind his journalist, refused to identify him to the government when demanded to do so, and then ultimately had to resign, or he may not have had a choice in that, but he did resign. When he left, every employee from the BBC, which was about 20,000 individuals, lined the streets to watch him leave. So when you see that on TV, and I remember watching it, you kind of think, this guy actually did what he said. He really gave people purpose. He gave them a reason to get up in the morning and come to work. And I think that spoke a lot to his leadership, which should be based on motivation and reward. It should be challenging and supportive. And fundamentally, as we've already talked about, based on trust. And again, looking back at my own experiences, particularly at Bart's, I never forget, I just started, it was day one of my attending job. And I'd worked there as a trainee, but this is kind of it. It's kind of, you become everything you tried to become, a consultant in the NHS. And my mentor and colleague, and previously been my supervisor for my research, I'll never forget, he put his arm around me as we were walking down between the EP labs, and he said, we need to get you out of your comfort zone. And I remember thinking, I'm actually quite happy in my comfort zone. Maybe give me 3 months in the comfort zone, and then we'll think about moving me out. But I knew from prior experiences with him and working with him that he was going to be 100% behind me. So yes, he was going to challenge me. Yes, he was going to push me, because pushing me made me better, and it made everything better as well, because we're all constituent parts of that team. For reasons that I won't go into, not out of time, but because I have absolutely no good explanation for this, but I'm a big Seattle Seahawks fan. I think I just do it to annoy the New Englanders. But this is a quote that came from their organization, or someone wrote this about their organization. Every day, the environment is primed to instill energy, optimism, and psychological safety. Now, I know the budgets of NHL teams are somewhat different to the budgets we're used to in healthcare, but imagine going to an organization, going to work every day where people are fundamentally focusing on creating that environment. The third of our sort of key tenets was belonging. This is an absolutely brilliant, I think Andrew's gone, but he was looking for books to read on vacation this summer. But if I could recommend one, it's this book, Belonging. It's an absolutely brilliant book. It's written by a guy called Owen Eastwood. Owen Eastwood is of Maori heritage. He's a New Zealander. And so he goes back into sort of a lot of the ancient principles of the Maoris, and sort of, rather than seeing these as sort of bygone, interesting facts of history, he says, actually, we've forgotten these basic principles that are really important and we should be using today. It's quite a spiritual book, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But I think the best story is about this guy on the right. He's called Andrew White, again, a New Zealander. And I'm not going to tell you the story because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. But if one thing in this book encapsulates the power of belonging and purpose, it's his story. So I will let you enjoy that yourselves. But it's a really, really great book. And this, for me, was the sort of key word. Belonging was that key word. I remember vividly, I was walking my dog down the river one night, and it suddenly dropped into my head, and I heard it. And I sort of thought, it took you 8 years to think of that, but there we go. It's how these things work. But belonging is so key. And when I explored that more, it's, well, the environment in which a team functions is so important. And that's been sort of proven that actually the environment relates to 60 to 80% of performance. And that came from a study from the British Olympic Association with some people from Harvard as well. And this sense of belonging is fundamentally the cornerstone of the environment in which we work. This is what Owen Eastwood talks about: an individual's connection to their role in the team, understanding why you're there, what's your job, how do you do it. An individual's connection to their team members, teams that are connected and care for each other, their performance is definitively enhanced. And an individual's connection to a higher purpose than the team. Understanding that this is much more of a collective approach than it is an individual approach. And collectively, it's much better to be successful than it is in an individual. And that, again, very much goes back to this concept of mana, which is a Polynesian Maori concept, which kind of means respect. And so you do everything for your village, for your tribe, for your people. But those are sort of the key tenets that he calls about performing, about how to create a high-performing team. Again, how does that relate to healthcare? Well, this is another paper by Amy Edmondson from 10 years back, and Melissa Valentine, who I think was her postdoc or PhD student at the time. They went to an unnamed inner city hospital. I suspect it was somewhere in Boston, and it was the emergency department. And they changed the traditional structure of how that emergency department worked. They call this process teaming. And they created these team scaffolds, so specific teams. There was 1 attending, 2 residents, and 3 nurses within that team. They were in a pod, and they worked specifically in that pod, and they worked with that team overnight. They had a 40% increase in patient throughput just by doing this. If you went to any emergency room director now and said, I can increase the throughput in your ED by 40%, they'd bite your hand off. So a huge, huge improvement. They then went on to say, you know, what that was. It was boundedness. It was explicitly clear who was in my team, who I was working with that day, the role in the team, and then the collective responsibility of that team. I think this individual says, you know, you own the patient. It's no ifs or buts. That's your role for that time of period. And again, one of the quotes that came out of this was this sense of belonging that enhanced camaraderie and ownership while reducing the hierarchy, which acts as a barrier to communication. Again, hierarchy and psychological safety are fundamentally opposed, and that breaking down that hierarchy led to the important transference of key clinical data. And at the end of the paper, they went on to say, we could not believe that something quite as simple as this led to such a dramatic improvement. So I think there is really good evidence starting to accrue, even though this is 10 years old now, that creating high-performing teams structured in the way that I've explained has significant impact on performance in hospitals and on clinical outcomes. So the second sort of piece for me was working, I went on a course. It was still in the middle of COVID, and because I'd enjoyed Owen Eastwood's book so much, I followed him on LinkedIn, and this course was advertised, and Owen Eastwood tagged it, and he said, this will be good with Walshy. He's a Kiwi, so he just goes by Walshy. It's just easier. And he's the mental skills and performance coach for a team called the Chiefs, which are one of the rugby franchises in New Zealand. He works with Scottish rugby and then a team called the Newcastle Knights in Australia. And then, as you can see, a variety of non-sports related organizations, primarily within New Zealand. So I went on this course because it was the middle of COVID. We were all sort of looking for things to do. And it was all online. And it was sort of, this is when this struck me as how they do this in professional sports, how they create these teams, how they work with them constantly, and what is the role of a mental skills coach. So he will talk about the hierarchy of mental skills. I think it's very important to differentiate this from mental health. Equally important, but these two things are different. So mental skills, how we sort of develop the skills to work on ourselves to get to where we want to be. So he'll talk about this as bridging the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And he also refers to it as the top 10% club. So if you're an average surgeon, doing this is not going to make you a brilliant surgeon, but it's going to allow you to perform to the maximum of your ability. So grow yourself. Do you have a personal strategy to achieve your goals? Who are your people and who are your supporters? Do you understand your team? Do you understand who your people are? Grow your mindset. Are you capable and excited, or are you sort of more incapable and worried? And he works a lot in baseball, in MLB beforehand. And he told this story about a pitcher who was on the mound during a playoff game and got into this mindset of thinking, well, if I don't get this guy out, I might not get a contract next year. If I don't get a contract next year, I can't afford the house. My wife will probably leave me because, you know, I'm not good for anything anymore. And he went through this whole mental dialogue in his head on the mound pitching in a playoff game. So you can see how important it is that we train our mindset, and there's been a lot of work around this as well. And then pressure. Pressure is universal. Everyone in every walk of life experiences it. Everyone in healthcare. We all know what it's like. We all do it. Whatever you do in healthcare, it exists. It's there. So rather than thinking, I'm going to, you know, get into a situation where pressure doesn't exist, where there's no stress, that isn't going to happen. So we're thinking about, well, how do we work towards it? How do we embrace it? How do we become comfortable with it? This is a guy called Richie McCaw. He's a New Zealander. This is him winning the World Cup in 2015. He's kind of like the Wayne Gretzky of rugby, I think would be fair to say. And one of his quotes is, you can't have high performance without the pressure. They go hand in hand. Most people spend their whole time trying to avoid it, but to be at your best, you must learn to embrace it. And I don't know, many of you have been to New Zealand. It's a small country. Rugby is everything. If you're captain of the national team, the pressure is unbelievable. So he sort of learned to embrace it. And then, well, what does this mental skills coach do? You can think of them as a human factors individual, organizational behavioral psychologist. It comes under a variety of different guises, but it's essentially the same role. And so Aaron talks about how this can be sort of used in different organizations. Well, the first is you don't have anything at all, no program whatsoever. Second is minimal or circumstantial. You've all been to the annual retreat, you have a great chat, everyone walks out the door and has forgotten about it by tomorrow. The deficit model, a reactive approach. Fred and Bob, you're not performing very well. You've got to go and see the sports psychologist or the whoever it is, the psychologist, because we need to make you better. So therefore you're doing this not because we want you to be at your best, but because you're underperforming. And therefore this becomes very much associated with underperforming and is seen as a punishment. A skill model, getting better. You ascribe a need, prescribe an intervention, and then monitor the outcome. But of course, ultimately what we want is the integrated model. How do we integrate this mental skill performance, thinking about all these different aspects into the day-to-day life of this organization, of this team? And I was very lucky. I've just come back from New Zealand. I was with Aaron and his team, the Chiefs, and it was a fascinating day just to sit at the back and sort of watch how he was fully integrated into it. And he plays a very different role from the coach, or you could say the chief of your department. He's sort of there and integrates and mingles through everything. So it's a very integrated and interesting role. And a lot of the players would speak to him afterwards for several hours, sort of understanding how they could maximize their performance. So it's a huge role of trust because they speak to him, and it doesn't necessarily go back to the head coach, but fundamentally important, the head coach believes that he should be there and that he has an important role to play. I was fascinated, how could this be integrated into, again, healthcare, and particularly cardiac healthcare? Some of you may know this story, but this is the story of a cardiac surgeon in the UK called Mark de Laval. And he was sadly just deceased. But in the late 80s, early 90s, a new operation came in for transposition of the great artery, which was the arterial switch operation, which came originally, I think, from Brazil. And Mark was he was the chief of cardiac surgery at Great Ormond Street in the UK. And they were changing from one operation they'd done historically to this. And this is his results, as you can see. The first 48 cases went extremely well, hardly had any deaths. And this was a brand new operation in an era when that was outstanding results. And then he had this, as he called it, a cluster of failures. So several kids died perioperatively, and he could not understand why. He was doing exactly the same. Bypass time was the same. The anatomy was, identical. He could not understand why. So being a very sort of thoughtful individual, he actually went and retrained. And this was at a time there was an awful lot of consternation in the UK around cardiac surgery for children, particularly the arterial switch operation that led to a national inquiry. But Mark took himself off, went and retrained, and then came back. As you can see, his performance went back to how it was. So he was fascinated, not about, well, what was the process, but what were the people involved in the operation. So they put human factors psychologists into every arterial switch operation for an 18-month period in the UK. And they looked at what was, these people were just standing at the back and observing, and how did teams function? How did they work? How could they get themselves out of difficult situations when they got into them? And of course, teams that were working a lot together were much better at doing that than teams that weren't, and that fundamentally related to how many operations they were doing, which drove a lot of the kind of volume thinking in cardiac surgery. But I would be fascinated to know, well, what happens if that psychologist wasn't just watching, but was actually integrated into what this team was doing? If they were working with them, I think that would be a fascinating study to do, and thinking about how do we integrate this into what we do. If you think this is just all about sports, it's not. This is ING, which is a Dutch bank. And they thought they wanted to restructure and reframe their organization. So they used some really interesting words here. Their workforce was divided into squads, which was specialists of lots of different areas. The chapters were all one specialty. So the chapters could all be heart failure specialists, for example, and they were all in different squads. The squads came together as a tribe, and the tribes worked on a specific projects, or they were working on mortgages or whatever it was. They had a lead and they had a coach. So that tribe had a coach embedded in them, and you can see the sort of the benefits that have come out of that. So this is happening in other industries, and I think really it's fundamental that we embrace this in healthcare. One of the questions that we're always asked, and we're about to try and launch this in Boston, is, well, how do you measure it? This is all great. This all sounds fantastic. How do you measure it? Well, I think there are many ways you can do that. That Amy Edmondson study showed it. This is one of the things that we're working on. It's a Toyota type model where you identify a problem, root causes, and then understand the headwinds that may influence change, devise a new state, and then reassess. There's a great paper in the New England Journal of Medicine published in, I think it's 2018, called Stop Doing Stupid Things, I think is the title of the paper. And it's written from the Hawaii healthcare system. And one of the people there looked at all the things that people were doing that were sort of a fundamental, not necessary, and actually took up a lot of hours and money. One of my favorites was when someone went to the emergency department, they had to get the patient to sign the paper that they said. And they said, well, why do we get someone to do this? They would say, well, legal told us we have to do it. So, okay, so they employed someone purely to then scan that document. So it went back into the chart because the patient had to sign it. And they then actually went and spoke to the legal team, and they said, no, you don't have to do that. No need at all. So they had this whole person doing something completely unnecessary of scanning these documents back in. So that's a really good read as well. But you can measure this in multiple different ways. But what we're trying to do is encourage teams to identify problems themselves, implement change, and really sort of from a ground up approach. And so just coming back to my original slide, it's all about the people. I think this is a really important point. This is and Thomas and I were discussing this last night, this is a baseball pitch. I don't think that's the right term. I'm British, but it's square. So this is in Boston. This is a suburb of Boston called Everett, which is north of the city. And this is where my son played a little league between June 2020, when, as you can imagine, it was an absolute lifesaver, although I'm no baseball fan. And he did that for 3 years, as they do between 10 and 12. The building just behind the baseball diamond is Best Buy. And you can see there's the parking lot there as well. And I kept driving in there because that's what we thought, how the hell is Best Buy still functioning? We've got Apple, we've got all these incredible organizations. How does Best Buy still operating when so many of its competitors and others had gone bankrupt? Well, the answer is in this book. It's by Hubert Joly, who's a Frenchman who came in as their CEO in 2012. And sort of the clue to what it's about is in the title. The heart of business is all about the people. And he got the people right. That was the fundamental approach. And Best Buy went from sort of almost going bankrupt in 2012 to becoming highly successful in 2020. So that's how they managed to survive, by working with the people, getting the people right, getting the teams right. So just to conclude, I think teamwork is an essential component of healthcare. I think it's something that we really need to focus on. And as I said, I do believe there's fundamental evidence already, and we need to develop more. This is associated with improved outcomes. It's important to focus on the people, the environment where each team member feels they belong, is valued, and has a purpose. And I think to maximize, we really need to integrate this into healthcare and have this as part of what we do. And it should be part of sort of medical education just as much as learning to read an ECG or an echo is in the current era. So I think it's hugely important. This is my team, the people I work with in sort of lots of different guises. It's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be part of it. And again, thank you very much for your attention and the invitation to speak to you today. So thanks. If I kept the time-ish.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much. Oh, yes, go ahead. Oh.
Hi, everyone. Dominic, thanks so much for that. As I was listening to you speak, I mean, for myself, was able to reflect on really the absolute privilege of working over the course of my career in what's been really a highly functional team. So I've been very lucky that way. But one thing that I have found challenging, we have found challenging, is COVID was a disruption, and then there's a lot of work from home. I'd just love your thoughts on the impact of virtual teams to this dynamic. I'm hoping you'll have a perfect answer to solve our problems.
There's a huge amount written about it, actually. It's very interesting about how do you manage virtual teams. And I think it's particularly difficult for people whose first job when they came out of college in, let's say, 2021, their first job was online. I mean, that's how they worked. So I think there are ways to manage it. In short, I think it's difficult. I think it's about creating time for that team to be, we were talking about this last night, how the personal piece is just so important. You know, in Britain, it was all about going to the pub on a Friday night after work. And that sounds a bit cliche, Simon's nodding, but it was a hugely important social, cultural piece of what we did. And I don't think you can replace that. Nothing online, because you know half the people aren't listening. Someone's on their phone, someone, you know, that's the way it is. But I think it's very much about trying to integrate that with the personal side of things. So when people are online, they have these reference points, they have these frameworks, but it's hard. I think there's a lot of benefits to virtual work. We've all enjoyed it, but I think maintaining that sort of team structure is very, very difficult. We, you know, we did a lot in COVID to try and do things online that were as much social as I'm sure many people did, as they were about work. So I think it's hard, but there's a huge amount out there about it actually that's written that might be very helpful. I'm happy to send some.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah, Daryl.
When you're talking about Aaron Walsh and growing yourself and making a difference, and starting from that base level, what are your thoughts about the team doing positive affirmations every day just before you get started, just to motivate inside? Do you have any comments on that?
I think I'll give two answers to that. I think it's very dependent on how that team functions, and different teams work in different ways and are successful in different ways. And so what we've tried to create is an environment where teams create their own culture, those unwritten rules. I personally think it's very important. When I was in New Zealand, I went to a place called Tauranga, which is where the New Zealand Rugby Sevens team are working, which is a shorter form of rugby, which is in the Olympics. So they're training for Paris. The first thing they did every morning as a team was they would sing. And that was their cultural piece. And they had people with Samoan heritage, Fijian heritage, you know, white New Zealanders, Maori. And they all brought songs together. And they had like 15 or 16 now different songs. And they would sing a song each morning as a way to learn about each other's cultures and to bond. And we were talking to one of the English guys who said, you try singing this in Fijian, it's nearly impossible. But, you know, it was to them, it was a really important cultural piece. And so, yes, I personally really believe in it. We have different things in our teams that are sort of similar. You don't want to hear me sing, I promise. So, you know, I think that's very important, but it's what works best for that team.
Dominic, great talk.
Thank you.
What kind of tips can you give us for how we optimize our own teams? Structures in hospitals sometimes are very inflexible. The management above us is inflexible. I work somewhere where we are very dynamic, but what kind of tips do you have for teams where maybe we don't have the same freedom to make changes? How can we optimize and get the best out of the team?
Well, I think that's very difficult. As I said, if you haven't got organizational buy-in, and that was one of Hackman's kind of 5 principles of successful teams, it's challenging. But I think you can still work and develop your own things. And I think what we found, again, building a team where it was new, I wouldn't say there was a structure, it was just new, that developing things that we could show we were doing rather than telling was a much better way. So sort of creating a system whereby people could look at us and see, oh yeah, they're doing something right. And I can see the benefits of this. It doesn't really sort of matter who those people are. That's how we were sort of successful in building things gradually. But I think what's really important, and I should have said this, but the context of this situation is so fundamentally important. You can't take a playbook from rugby or hockey or music and just drop it into healthcare and expect it's going to produce the results. So I think it's really important about growing it from the ground up in a way that works for that specific team. And of course, teams can break down, reform over time because there's different things to do. But I think if you can get the mindset into everyone, there's a lot as well written about, I didn't have time to discuss it, but there's a lot written about Microsoft. And when Satya Nadella came in 2014, although it's superficial, they looked like a great organization, their share price was good. It was a really broken organization. And there's some really interesting work written about it, that he fundamentally changed the mindset of people. And that's now they're worth $1 trillion or whatever it is. So I think that's the best way to do it in an organization. You've got to show people what you're doing and how you're doing it. So.
Excellent.
Thank you.